Mr. President, there is a certain symbolism in the fact that it was our British colleagues, who chair the Security Council this month, who pushed through today's meeting, timed it to coincide with 1,000 days since the Ukrainian crisis entered a hot phase. Once again, we'd have had an excellent opportunity to see that for you and your colleagues this is nothing more than a catchy media pretext for defaming Russia, and hanging on it the worn-out labels that predictably abound in the speeches of Western members of the Council. And in your country, the United Kingdom, Russophobia was elevated to the rank of state policy long ago, long before February 2022. Let me remind you that in preparing for today's meeting, you missed another media occasion that is much more important in the context of the Ukrainian crisis than the date you chose. Last Friday, November 15, it was exactly 950 days since the visit of former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson to Kyiv, when, as we all know for sure today, he dissuaded the head of the Kyiv regime from signing a peace agreement initialed in Istanbul with Russia, which would stop hostilities. At that time, we were very close to it. As a gesture of goodwill, Russia even withdrew troops from northern Ukraine, in particular in the immediate vicinity of Kyiv. In other words, 50 days after the start of our special military operation, when the losses in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine were not so significant that hostilities had every chance of stopping, if not for the intervention of the British Prime Minister, who convinced Zelensky that he should continue to fight, and that with the help of Western weapons and support, he could well inflict a strategic defeat on Russia, in which the British Prime Minister and his Western accomplices were interested. And in order to somehow explain this turn of events in the Ukrainian and international community, with the direct involvement of the British Special Services and the media, an absolutely clumsy provocation was concocted in Bucha, where after the withdrawal of the Russian army, the corpses of people were brought and laid out on the streets, the origin and real cause of death of which no one bothered to explain, despite our repeated requests. In general, it turns out that the UK pushed the Kyiv regime towards imminent defeat, provoking its choice in favor of continuing confrontation with Russia. I think that Ukraine will not forget for a long time that it is thanks to these actions of your country that this state is now in a terrible economic state, has lost most of its army and military equipment, and has also lost at least 4 regions, in addition to Crimea, which seceded from Ukraine back in 2014. Ukrainians have not wanted to fight for a long time. The Ukrainian army has forgotten about what volunteers are for 2 years, and the Kyiv regime, having closed the exit of men from the country, today catches draft dodgers on the streets, including with the use of firearms, and throws them into a senseless meat grinder with almost no preparation. The eastern front of the armed forces of Ukraine in Donbass is collapsing before our eyes. You are well aware of the pace of advance of our army, and the Zelensky regime, trying to maintain the support of the West, undertook an absolutely senseless sortie into the Kursk region and tried to seize and mine the Kursk nuclear power plant, which cost the armed forces of Ukraine several tens of thousands of well-trained soldiers. This adventure was a fatal mistake and only accelerated the imminent impending defeat of Ukraine on the battlefield, which no new Western weapons can help it avoid. The initiators of today's meeting should, by way of transparency, share with us what fabulous profits the UK has received for almost 3 years of military support for Ukraine, how your arms companies have enriched themselves on the blood and tragedies of ordinary Ukrainians, and how your Defense Department has successfully disposed of old military equipment that would still have to be disposed of. And it would also be nice to talk about the corruption that accompanies these processes, the scale of which can only be guessed. So, as the Ukrainian media themselves write, after Donald Trump's victory in the US elections, panic began among the Ukrainian elite, not even because of the fact that the United States may reconsider assistance to Ukraine, but because the new authorities may want to deal with all the money that was sent to Ukraine and conduct a full audit of the aid already provided. This scenario, as Ukrainian experts unanimously note, is much more terrible for Zelensky, because a significant part of the aid is simply stolen and appropriated by the expired Ukrainian president and his entourage. Given that the volume of military assistance to the Kyiv junta from the UK since February 2022 amounted to $9.7 billion, your country is undoubtedly contributing to the growth of corruption in Ukraine. However, it is unlikely that we will wait for any relevant investigations by the British authorities, because in such cases, as you know, it is important for investigators not to come out on themselves. Mr. President, as a matter of fact, for those familiar with the history of the United Kingdom, its long-term intervention in Ukraine, which culminated in the actions we mentioned above, was not a revelation. After all, the UK has been engaged in pitting neighbors against each other, sowing discord between states and peoples, and then supporting some of them against others. For centuries, all your former colonies can tell about it in colors. By the way, out of the current 193 members of the UN, only 22 states can boast that their territory has never been invaded and never fought by Great Britain. Our country is no exception here. The last such invasion was the British intervention after the revolutionary events of 1917, when various predators and vultures tried to pull Russia to pieces. But we have survived, we have gone through it, we have grown stronger, and now we have to fight against a new proxy intervention of members fighting against Russia in Ukraine, NATO, including the UK. This is how one can perceive not only the ongoing pumping of weapons into the Kyiv regime and its feeding with intelligence, but also the presence of British instructors and mercenaries, hundreds of whom have already been eliminated, as well as attempts by British specialists to localize the production of drones, missiles, and unmanned boats in Ukraine. We understand that it is difficult to leave Ukraine and Russia alone in the 21st century, because the genes of those colonizers who have been rampaging in Asia, Africa, and Europe for centuries are taking their toll. We'd all know that the British Empire brutally and cynically suppressed the resistance of its colonies for 250 years, resorted to forced assimilation and racial discrimination, forgetting about simple human values and the rights of the peoples under its control. It was the civilian population of the colonized countries that paid with their lives and freedom for the imperial ambitions of the metropolis. Suffice it to recall at least the ethnic cleansing in Ireland, when out of more than 1.5 million people after the British conquest, only 850,000 remained. And during the Second Boer War at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, it was the British who first invented concentration camps and herded the civilian population into them so that they would not help the Boer army. It is not known how many people died then, because the British did not consider the indigenous population of Africa to be people, and in principle, did not document the losses among Africans. Although it is known that in Kenya, after the uprising of Mau Mau, the British staged mass repressions, killing about 300,000 representatives of this nationality and driving another 1.5 million people into camps and turning them into slaves. And in India, which suffered enormous damage during the period of British rule, from 15 to 29 million people fell victim to the famine caused by Great Britain alone. The consequences of the actions of former colonizers are still felt in the modern world. And although colonial empires are formally a thing of the past, the old methods, pressure, manipulation, and interference in sovereign affairs continue to be used in new forms. Britain is not only not an exception here, but rather a trendsetter, and to this day, experiencing phantom pains for the empire on which the sun never set, nostalgic for the lost world domination, together with Franco-Saxon like-minded people, uses blackmail and sanctions, is engaged in the overthrow of undesirable governments through color revolutions, one of the victims of which in 2014 was Ukraine. We're saying all this to the point that there is no moral right to blame or reproach our country, which has set itself the task of getting rid of the nationalist and neo-Nazi hornet's nest on our borders that you have nurtured. Until the threats from it, including the absorption of Ukraine by NATO, are eliminated, until discrimination against the Russian-speaking population on the basis of language, faith, history stops, until Ukraine stops whitewashing and glorifying Hitler's accomplices, our special operation will continue. Its goals will be realized in any case, diplomatically or militarily, regardless of any peace plans and schemes developed in the West in the interests of saving the entertainment actor Zelensky and his clique. And regardless of the militaristic frenzy of the Democratic administration, which, having miserably lost the presidential election and lost the trust of most of its own population, is handing out, according to media reports, suicidal permissions to the Zelensky regime to use long-range weapons to strike deep into Russian territory. Perhaps Joe Biden himself, for many reasons, has nothing to lose but the short-sightedness of the leadership of Great Britain and France, which are in a hurry to play along with the outgoing administration and drag not only their countries, but also the whole of Europe into a full-scale escalation with extremely serious consequences. This is what our former Western partners should think about before it is too late. This should also be remembered by those who have recently started talking about a kind of freezing of the front and various schemes, similar to the Minsk agreements, rejected by Ukraine and its Western curators. Do not waste time. We no longer have confidence in you, and we will only be satisfied with a solution that addresses the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis and does not allow anything like this to happen again. And we advise you to forget about attempts to defeat Russia on the battlefield. Europe has tried to do this more than once, and it is well known how it ended for it each time. Thank you for your attention.